Good.
There we go.
Okay, all right. So for anyone who might be watching the video later, we are beginning chapter 4, A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man Today. Right. And I believe I am the first reader. Let me confirm. Yep, still the first reader. Okay, chapter 4. Everybody can hear me okay?
All good.
All right. Sunday was dedicated to the mystery of the Holy Trinity. Monday to the Holy Ghost, Tuesday to the guardian angels, Wednesday to Saint Joseph, Thursday to the most blessed sacrament of the altar, Friday to the suffering Jesus, Saturday to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Every morning he hallowed himself anew in the presence of some holy image or mystery. His day began with a heroic offering of its every moment of thought and action for the intentions of the sovereign pontiff, and with an early mass. The raw morning air whetted his resolute piety. And often, as he knelt among the few worshippers at the side altar, following with his interleaved prayer book the murmur of the priest, he glanced up for an instant towards the vested figure standing in the gloom between the two candles, which were the Old and New Testaments, and imagined that he was kneeling at Mass in the catacombs. Okay, next, please.
His daily life was laid out in devotional areas. By means of ejaculations and prayers, he stored up ungrudgingly for the souls in purgatory centuries of days and quarantines and years. Yet the spiritual triumph which he felt in achieving with ease so many fabulous ages of canonical penances did not wholly reward his zeal of prayer, since he could never know how much temporal punishment he had remitted by way of suffrage for the agonizing soul. And fearful lest in the midst of the purgatorial fire, which differed from the infernal only in that it was not everlasting, his penance might avail no more than a drop of moisture. He drove his soul daily through an increasing circle of works of supererogation. Every part of his day, divided by what he regarded now as the duties of his station in life, circled about its own center of spiritual energy. His life seemed to have drawn near to eternity. Every thought, word, and deed, every instance of consciousness could be made to revibrate radiantly in heaven. And at times, his sense of such immediate repercussion was so lively that he seemed to feel his soul in devotion pressing like fingers the keyboard of a great cash register, and to see the amount of his purchase start forth immediately in heaven, not as a number, but as a frail column of incense or as a slender flower. Next, please.
The rosaries, too, were he said constantly, for he carried his beads loose in his trousers pockets, that he might tell them as he walked the streets, transformed themselves into coronings of flower of such vague, unearthly texture that they seemed to him as hueless and odorless as they were nameless. He offered up each of his 3 daily chaplets, that his soul might grow stronger in each of the 3 theological virtues, in faith in the Father who had created him, in hope in the Son who had redeemed him, and in love of the Holy Ghost who had sanctified him. And this thrice triple prayer he offered to the 3 persons through Mary, in the name of her joyful and sorrowful and glorious mysteries. On each of the 7 days of the week, he further prayed that one of the 7 gifts of the Holy Ghost might descend upon his soul and drive out of it day by day the 7 deadly sins which had defiled it in the past. And he prayed for each gift on its appointed day, confident that it would descend upon him, though it seemed strange to him at times that wisdom and understanding and knowledge were so distinct in their nature that each should be prayed for apart from the others. Yet he believed that at some future point of his spiritual progress, this difficulty would be removed when his sinful soul had been raised up from its weakness and enlightened by the third person of the most blessed Trinity. He believes this all the more, and with trepidation because of the divine gloom and silence wherein dwelt the unseen Paraclete, whose symbols were a dove and a mighty wind. To sin against whom was a sin beyond forgiveness, the eternal mystery secret being to whom, as God, the priest offered up a mass once a year, robed in the scarlet of the tongues of fire. Next, please.
The imagery through which the nature and kinship of the three persons of the Trinity were darkly shadowed forth in the books of devotion which he read. The Father contemplating from all eternity as in a mirror his divine perfections, and thereby begetting eternally the eternal Son and the Holy Spirit, proceeding out of Father and Son from all eternity, were easier of acceptance by his mind by reason of their august incomprehensibility than was the simple fact that God had loved his soul from all eternity for ages before he had ever been born into the world, for ages before the world itself had existed. He had heard the names of the passions of love and hate pronounced solemnly on the stage and in the pulpit, had found them set forth solemnly in books, and had wondered why his soul was unable to harbor them for any time or to force his lips to utter their names with conviction. A brief anger had often invested him, but he had never been able to make it an abiding passion, and had always felt himself passing out of it as if his very body were being divested with ease of some outer skin or peel. He had felt a subtle, dark, and murmurous presence penetrate his being and fire him with a brief, iniquitous lust. It too had slipped beyond his grasp, leaving his mind lucid and indifferent. This, it seemed, was the only love, and that the only hate his soul would harbor. But he could no longer disbelieve in the reality of love, since God himself had loved his individual soul with divine love from all eternity. Gradually, as his soul was enriched with spiritual knowledge, he saw the whole world forming one vast symmetrical expression of God's power and love. Life became a divine gift for every moment, and sensation of which, were it even the sight of a single leaf hanging on the twig of a tree, his soul should praise and thank the giver. The world, for all its solid substance and complexity, no longer existed for his soul, save as a theorem of divine power and love and universality. So entire and unquestionable was this sense of the divine meaning in all nature granted to his soul, that he could scarcely understand why it was in any way necessary that he should continue to live. Next, please.
Yet that was the part of the divine purpose, and he dared not question its use. He, above all others who had sinned so deeply and so foully against the divine purpose. Meek and abased by this consciousness of one of the eternal, omnipresent, perfect reality, his soul took up again her burden of pieties, masses and prayers and sacraments and mortifications, and only then, for the first time since he had brooded on the great mystery of love, did he feel within him a warm movement like that of some newly born life or virtue of the soul itself. The attitude of rapture in sacred art, the raised and parted hands, the parted lips and eyes as of one about to swoon, became for him an image of the soul in prayer, humiliated and faint before her Creator. But he had been forewarned of the dangers of spiritual exaltation and did not allow himself to desist from even the least or lowliest devotion, striving also by constant mortification to undo the sinful past rather than to achieve a saintliness fraught with peril. Each of his senses was brought under a rigorous discipline. In order to mortify the sense of sight, he made it his rule to walk in the street with downcast eyes, glancing neither right nor left, and never behind him. His eyes shunned every encounter with the eyes of women. From time to time, also, he balked them by sudden effort of the will, and by lifting them suddenly in the middle of an unfinished sentence and closing the book. To mortify his hearing, he exerted no control over his voice, which was then breaking, neither sang nor whistled, and made no attempts to flee from noises which caused him painful nervous irritation, such as the sharpening of knives on the knife board, the gathering of cinders on the fire shovel, and the twigging of the carpet. Next, please.
To mortify his smell was more difficult, as he found in himself no instinctive repugnance to bad odors, whether they were the odors of the outdoor world, such as those of dung and tar, or the odors of his own person, among which he had made many curious comparisons and experiments. He found in the end that the only odor against which his sense of smell revolted was a certain stale, fishy stink like that of a long-standing urine. And whenever it was possible, he subjected himself to this unpleasant odor. To mortify the taste, he practiced strict habits at table, observed to the letter all the fasts of the church, and sought by distraction to divert his mind from the savors of different foods. But it was to the mortification of touch that he brought the most assiduous ingenuity of inventiveness. He never consciously changed his position in bed, sat in the most uncomfortable positions, suffered patiently every itch and pain, kept away from the fire, remained on his knees all through the Mass except at the Gospels, left parts of his neck and face undried so the air might sting them, and whenever he was not saying his beads, carried his arms stiffly at his sides like a runner, and never in his pockets or clasped behind him. Next, please.
He had no temptations to sin mortally. It surprised him, however, to find that at the end of his course of intricate piety and self-restraint, he was so easily at the mercy of childish and unworthy imperfections. His prayers and fasts availed him little for the suppression of anger at hearing his mother sneeze or at being disturbed in his devotions. It needed an immense effort of his will to master the impulse which urged him to give outlet to such irritation. Images of the outburst of trivial anger, which he had often noted among his masters, their twitching mouths, close shut lips, and flushed cheeks, recurred to his memory, discouraging him for all his practice of humility by the comparison. To merge his life in the common tide of other lives was harder for him than any fasting or prayer, and it was his constant failure to do this to his own satisfaction which caused in his soul at last a sensation of spiritual dryness, together with a growth of doubts and scruples. His soul traversed a period of desolation in which the sacraments themselves seemed to have turned into dried up sources. His confession became a channel to the escape of scrupulous and unrepented imperfections. His actual reception of the Eucharist did not bring him the same dissolving moments of virginal self-surrender as did those spiritual communions made by him sometimes at the close of some visit to the Blessed Sacrament. The book which he's used for these visits was an old neglected book written by St. Alphonsus Liguori, with fading characters and sere fox-papered leaves. A faded world of fervent love and virginal responses seemed to be evoked for his soul by the reading of its pages, in which the imagery of canticles was interwoven with the communicant's prayers. An inaudible voice seemed to caress the soul, telling her names and glories, bidding her arise as for a spousal and come away, bidding her look forth, a spouse, from Amana and from the mountains of the leopards. And the soul seemed to answer with the same inaudible voice, surrendering herself. Inter ubera mea comorabitur. Next.
This idea of surrender had a perilous attraction for his mind. Now that he felt his soul beset once again by the insistent voices of the flesh which began to murmur to him again during his prayers and meditations. It gave him an intense sense of power to know that he could, by a single act of consent, in a moment of thought, undo all that he had done. He seemed to feel a flood slowly advancing towards his naked feet, and to be waiting for the first faint, timid, noiseless wavelet to touch his fevered skin. Then, almost at an instant of that touch, almost at the verge of sinful consent, he found himself standing far away from the flood upon a dry shore, saved by a sudden act of the will or sudden ejaculation, and seeing the silver line of the floor far away and beginning again its slow advance towards his feet. A new thrill of power and satisfaction shook his soul to know that he had not yielded nor undone all. When he had eluded the flood of temptation many times in this way, he grew troubled and wondered whether the grace which he had refused to lose was not being flitched from him little by little. The dear incertitude of his own immunity grew dim, and to it succeeded a vague fear that his soul had really fallen unawares. It was with difficulty that he had won back his old consciousness of his state of grace by telling himself that he had prayed to God at every temptation, and that the grace which he had prayed for must have been given to him inasmuch as God was obliged to give it. The very frequency and violence of temptation showed him at last the truth of what he had heard about the trials of the saints. Frequent and violent temptations were a proof that the citadel of the soul had not fallen, and that the devil raged to make it fall. Next.
Often, when he had confessed his doubts and scruples, some momentary inattention at prayer, a movement of trivial anger in his soul, or a subtle willfulness in speech or act, he was bidden by his confessor to name some sin of his past life before absolution was given him. He named it with humility and shame and repented of it once more. It humiliated and shamed him to think that he would never be free from it wholly, however holily he might live, or whatever virtues or perfections he might attain. A restless feeling of guilt would always be present with him. He would confess and repent and be absolved, confess and repent again, and be absolved again, fruitlessly. Perhaps that first hasty confession wrung from him by the fear of hell had not been good. Perhaps, concerned only for his imminent doom, he had not had sincere sorrow for his sin. But the surest sign that his confession had been good and that he had had sincere sorrow for his sins was, he knew, the amendment of his life. I have amended my life, have I not? He asked himself. And
Okay. The director stood in the embrasure of the window, his back to the light, leaning an elbow on the brown cross blind, and as he spoke and smiled, slowly dangled and looping the cord of the other blind. Stephen stood before him, following for a moment with his eyes the waning of the long summer daylight above the roofs or the slow, deft movement of the priestly figures. The priest's face was in total shadow, but the waning daylight from behind him touched the deeply grooved temples and the curves of the skull. Stephen followed also with his ears the ascents and intervals of the priest's voice, as he spoke gravely and cordially of indifferent themes. The vacation which had just ended, the college of the order abroad, the transference of masters. The grave and cordial voice went on easily with its tale, and in the pauses Stephen felt bound to set it on again with respectful questions. He knew that the tale was a prelude, and his mind waited for the sequel. Ever since the message of summons had come for him from the director, his mind had struggled to find the meaning of the message. And during the long, restless time, he had sat in the college parlour, waiting for the director to come in. His eyes had wandered from one sober picture to another round the walls, and his mind wandered from one guest to another, until the meaning of the summons had almost become clear. Then, just as he was wishing that some unforeseen cause might prevent the director from coming, he had heard the handle of the door turning and the swish of a soutane. Next, please.
The director had begun to speak of the Dominican and Franciscan orders and of the friendship between St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure. The Capuchin dress, he thought, was rather too... Stephen's face gave back the priest's indulgent smile, and not being anxious to give an opinion, he made a slight dubitative movement with his lips. I believe, continued the director, that there is some talk now among the Capuchins themselves of doing away with it and following the example of the other Franciscans. I suppose they would retain it in the cloister, said Stephen. Oh, certainly, said the director. Oh, for the cloister, it is all right. But for the street, I really think it would be better to do away with it, don't you? It must be troublesome, I imagine. Of course it is, of course. Just imagine when I was in Belgium, I used to see them out cycling in all kinds of weather with this thing up about their knees. It was really ridiculous. Les jupes, they called them in Belgium. The vowel was so modified as to become indistinct. What do they call them? Les jupes. Oh. Stephen smiled again in answer to the smile which he could not see on the priest's shadowed face, its image or specter only passing rapidly across his mind as the low, discreet accent fell upon his ear. He gazed calmly before him at the waning sky, glad of the cool of the evening and the faint yellow glow which hid the tiny flame kindling upon his cheek. The names of articles of dress worn by women or of certain soft and delicate stuffs used in their making brought always to his mind a delicate and sinful perfume. As a boy, he had imagined the reins by which horses are driven as slender silken bands, and it shocked him to feel at Stadbrook the greasy leather of harness. It had shocked him, too, when he had felt for the first time beneath his tremulous fingers the brittle texture of a woman's stocking, for retaining nothing of all he read, save that which seemed to him an echo or a prophecy of his own state, it was only amid soft-worded phrases or within rose-soft stuffs that he dared to conceive of the soul or body of a woman moving with tender life. Next, please.
But the phrase on the priest's lips was disingenuous, for he knew that a priest should not speak lightly on that theme. The phrase had been spoken lightly with design, and he felt that his face was being searched by the eyes in the shadow. Whatever he had heard or read of the craft of Jesuits, he had put aside frankly, as not borne out by his own experience. His masters, even when they had not attracted him, had seemed to him always intelligent and serious priests, athletic and high-spirited prefects. He thought of them as men who washed their bodies briskly with cold water and wore clean, cold linen. During all the years he had lived among them in Conglos and in Belvedere, he had received only 2 pandies, and those had been dealt him in the wrong, he knew that he had often escaped punishment. During all those years, he had never heard from any of his masters a flippant word. It was they who had taught him Christian doctrine and urged him to live a good life. And when he had fallen into grievous sin, it was they who had led him back to grace. Their presence had made him diffident of himself when he was a muff in Clongowes, and it had made him diffident of himself also when he had held his equivocal position in Belvedere. A constant sense of this had remained with him up to the last year of his school life. He had never once disobeyed or allowed turbulent companions to seduce him from his habit of quiet obedience. And even when he doubted some statement of a master, he had never presumed to doubt openly. Lately, some of their judgments had sounded a little childish in his ears and had made him feel a regret and pity, as though he were slowly passing out of an accustomed world and were hearing its language for the last time. One day, when some boys had gathered round the priest under the shed near the chapel, he had heard the priest say, "Next, please."
I believe that Lord Macaulay was a man who probably never committed a mortal sin in his life, that is to say, a deliberate mortal sin. Some of the boys had then asked the priest if Victor Hugo were not the greatest French writer. The priest had answered that Victor Hugo had never written half so well when he had turned against the church as he had written when he was a Catholic. But there are many eminent French critics, said the priest, who consider that even Victor Hugo, great as he certainly was, had not so pure a French style as Louis Veuillot. The tiny flame which the priest's allusion had kindled upon Stephen's cheek had sunk down again, and his eyes were still fixed calmly on the colorless sky. But an unresting doubt flew hither and thither before his mind. Masked memories passed quickly before him. He recognized scenes and persons, yet he was conscious that he had failed to perceive some vital circumstance in them. He saw himself walking about the grounds, watching the sports in Clongowes, and eating Slim Jim out of his cricket cap. Some Jesuits were walking around the cycle track in the company of ladies. The echoes of certain expressions used in Clongowes sounded in remote caves of his mind. His ears were listening to these distant echoes amid the silence of the parlor when he became aware that the priest was addressing him in a different voice. "I sent for you today, Stephen, because I wish to speak with you on a very important subject." "Yes, sir." "Have you ever felt that you had a vocation?" Stephen parted his lips to answer yes, and then withheld the word suddenly. The priest waited for the answer and added, "I mean, have you ever felt within yourself, in your soul, a desire to join the order? Think." "I have sometimes thought of it," said Stephen. The priest let the blind cord fall to one side and, uniting his hands, leaned his chin gravely upon them, communing with himself. "In a college like this," he said at length, "there is one boy, or perhaps 2 or 3 boys, whom God calls to the religious life. Such a boy is marked off from his companions by his piety, by the good example he shows to others. He is looked up to by them. He is chosen perhaps as prefect by his fellow sodalists. And you, Stephen, have been such a boy in this college, prefect of our Blessed Lady's sodality. Perhaps you are the boy in this college whom God designs to call to himself." Next, please.
A strong note of pride, reinforcing the gravity of the priest's voice, made Stephen's heart quicken in response. "To receive that call, Stephen," said the priest, "is the greatest honor that Almighty God can bestow upon a man. No king or emperor on this earth has the power of the priest of God. No angel or archangel in heaven, no saint, not even the Blessed Virgin herself, has the power of a priest of God. The power of the keys, the power to bind and to loose from sin, the power of exorcism, the power to cast out from the creatures of God the evil spirits that have power over them, the power, the authority to make the great God of heaven come down upon the altar and take the form of bread and wine. What an awful power, Stephen." A flame began to flutter again in Stephen's cheek as he heard in this proud address an echo of his own proud musings. How often had he seen himself as a priest, wielding calmly and humbly the awful power of which angels and saints stood in reverence. His soul had loved to muse in secret on this desire. He had seen himself, a young and silent-mannered priest, entering a confessional swiftly, ascending the altar steps, incensing, genuflecting, accomplishing the vague acts of the priesthood which pleased him, by reason of their semblance of reality and of their distance from it. In that dim life which he had lived through in his musings, he had assumed the voices and gestures which he had noted with various priests. He had bent his knees sideways like such a one. He had shaken the thurible only slightly like such a one. His chasuble had swung open like that of such other as he turned to the altar again after having blessed the people. And above all, it had pleased him to fill the second place in those dim scenes of his imagining. He shrank away from the dignity of the celebrant because it displeased him to imagine that all the vague pomp should end in his own person, or that the ritual should assign him to so clear and final an office. He longed for the minor sacred offices, to be vested with the tunicle of subdeacon at high mass, to stand aloof from the altar, forgotten by the people, his shoulders covered with a humeral veil, holding the paten with its folds, or, when the sacrifice had been accomplished, to stand as a deacon in a dalmatic cloth of gold, on the step below the celebrant, his hands joined and his face towards the people, and sing the chant, Ite, Missa, Est. If ever Ray had seen himself celebrate, it was as in the pictures of the Mass in his child's Mass book, in a church without worshippers, save for the angel of the sacrifice, at a bare altar, and served by an acolyte scarcely more boyish than himself. In vague sacrificial and sacramental acts alone, his will seemed drawn to go forth to encounter reality. And it was partly the absence of an appointed rite which had always constrained him to inaction, whether he had allowed silence to cover his anger or pride, or had suffered only an embrace he longed to give. Next.
He listened in reverent silence now to the priest's appeal. And through the words, he heard even more distinctly a voice bidding him approach, offering him secret knowledge and secret power. He would know then what was the sin of Simon Magus, and what the sin against the Holy Ghost for which there is no forgiveness. He would know obscure things hidden from others, from those who were conceived and born children of wrath. He would know the sins, the sinful longings and sinful thoughts and sinful acts of others, hearing them murmured into his ears in the confessional under the shame of a darkened chapel by the lips of women and of girls, but rendered immune mysteriously at his ordination by the imposition of hands. His soul would pass again uncontaminated to the white peace of the altar. No touch of sin would linger upon the hands with which he would elevate and break the host. No touch of sin would linger on his lips in prayer to make him eat and drink damnation to himself, not discerning the body of the Lord. He would hold his secret knowledge and secret power, being as sinless as the innocent, and he would be a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Next, please.
I will offer up my Mass tomorrow morning, said the director, that Almighty God may reveal to you his holy will. And let you, Stephen, make a novena and let you, Stephen, make a novena to your holy patron saint, the first martyr, who is very powerful with God, that God may enlighten your mind. But you must be quite sure, Stephen, that you have a vocation, because it would be terrible if you found out afterwards that you had none. Once a priest, always a priest, remember. Your catechism tells you that the sacrament of holy orders is one of those which can be received only once, because it imprints on the soul an indelible spiritual mark which can never be effaced. It is before you must weigh well, not after. It is a solemn question, Stephen, because on it may depend the salvation of your eternal soul. but we will pray to God together. He held open the heavy hall door and gave his hand as if already to a companion in the spiritual life. Stephen passed out on to the wide platform above the steps and was conscious of the caress of mild evening air. Towards Finlayter's church, a quartet of young men were striding along with linked arms, swaying their heads and stepping to the agile melody of their leader's concertina. The music passed in an instant, as the first bars of sudden music always did, over the fantastic fabrics of his mind, dissolving them painlessly and noiselessly, as a sudden wave dissolves the sand-built turrets of children. Smiling at the trivial air, he raised his eyes to the priest's face and, seeing it in a mirthless rejection of the sunken day, detached his hands slowly, which had acquiesced faintly in companionship. Next, please.
As he descended the steps, the impression which effaced his troubled self-communion was that of a mirthless mask, reflecting a sunken day from the threshold of the college. The shadow, then, of the life of the college passed gravely over his consciousness. It was a grave and ordered and passionate life that awaited him, a life without material cares. He wondered how he would pass the first night in the novitate, and with that what dismay he would wake the first morning in the dormitory. The troubling odour of the long corridors of Clongloes came back to him, and he heard the discreet murmur of the burning gas fields. At once, from every part of his being, unrest began to irritate. A feverish quickening of his pulses followed, and a din of merciless words drove his reasoned thoughts hither and thither confusedly. His lungs dilated and sank as if he was inhaling a warm, moist, unsustaining air. And he smelt again the moist, warm air which hung in the bath in clouds above the sluggish, turf-coloured water. Some instant, waking at these memories, stronger than education or piety, quickened within him at every near approach to that life. An instinct subtle and hostile, and armed him against acquiescence. The chill and order of the life repelled him. He saw himself rising in the cold of the morning and filing down with the others to early mass, and trying vainly to struggle with his prayers against the fainting sickness of his stomach. He saw himself sitting at dinner with the community of the college. What, then, had become of that deep-rooted shyness of which had made him loath to eat or drink under a strange roof? What had become of the pride of his spirit, which had always made him conceive himself as being a part in every order? Next, please.
Bill, you need to turn on your microphone.
The Reverend Stephen Dedalus, S.J. His name in that new life leaped into characters before his eyes, and to it there followed a mental sensation of an undefined face or color of a face. The color faded and became strong like a changing glow of pallid brick red. Was it the raw reddish glow he had so often seen on wintry mornings on the shaven gills of the priests? The face was eyeless and sour-favored and devout, shot with pink tinges of suffocated anger. Was it not a mental specter of the face of one of the Jesuits, whom some of the boys called Lantern Jaws and others Foxy Campbell? He was passing at that moment before the Jesuit house in Gardner Street and wondered vaguely which window would be his if he ever joined the order. Then he wondered at the vagueness of his wonder, at the remoteness of his soul from what he had hitherto imagined her sanctuary, at the frail hold which so many years of order and obedience had of him when once a definite and irrevocable act of his threatened to end forever, in time and in eternity, his freedom. The voice of the director urging upon him the proud claims of the church and the mystery and power of the priestly office repeated itself idly in his memory. His soul was not there to hear and greet it, and he knew now that the exhortation he had listened to had already fallen into an idle, formal tale. He would never swing the thurible before the tabernacle as priest. His destiny was to be elusive of social or religious orders. The wisdom of the priest's appeal did not touch him to the quick. He was destined to learn his own wisdom apart from others, or to learn the wisdom of others himself, wandering among the snares of the world. The snares of the world were its ways of sin. He would fall. He had not yet fallen, but he would fall silently in an instant. Not to fall was too hard, and he felt the silent lapse of his soul, as it would be at some instant to come, falling, but not yet fallen, still unfallen, but about to fall. Next, please.
He crossed the bridge over the stream of the Tolka and turned his eyes coldly for an instant toward the faded blue shrine of the Blessed Virgin, which stood foul-wise on a pole in the middle of a ham-shaped encampment of pure cottages. Then, bending to the left, he followed the lane which led up to his house. The faint sour stink of fruited cabbages came toward him from the kitchen gardens on the rising ground above the river. He smiled to think that it was this disorder, the misrule and confusion of his father's house, and the stagnation of vegetable life, which was to win the day in his soul. Then a short laugh broke from his lips as he thought of that solitary farmhand in the kitchen gardens behind their house, whom they had nicknamed the man with the hat. A second laugh, taking rise from the first after a pause, broke from him involuntarily as he thought of how the man with the hat worked, considering in turn the 4 points of the sky, and then regretfully plunged his spade into the earth. He pushed open the latchless door of the porch and passed through the naked hallway into the kitchen. A group of his brothers and sisters was sitting round the table. Tea was nearly over, and only the last of the second watered tea remained in the bottoms of the small glass jars and jam pots which did service for teacups. Discarded crusts and lumps of sugared bread turned brown by the tea, which had been poured over them, lay scattered on the table. Little wells of tea laid here and there on the board, and a knife with a broken ivory handle was stuck through the pith with a ravaged turnover. The sad, quiet, gray-blue glow of the dying day came through the window, and the door, covering over and allaying quietly a sudden instinct of remorse in Stephen's heart. All that had been denied them had been freely given to him, the eldest. But the quiet glow of evening showed him in their faces no sign of rancor. Next, please.
He sat near them at the table and asked where his father and mother were. One answered, Gonborough, Toborough, Lookborough, Atborough, Arborough, Houseborough. Still another removal. A boy named Fallon in Belvedere had often asked him with a silly laugh why they moved so often. A frown of scorn darkened quickly his forehead as he heard again the silly laugh of the questioner. He asked, why are we on the move again, if that's a fair question? The same sister answered, because borough, the borough, Lamborough, Lordborough, Wilborough, Putborough, Usborough, Outborough. The voice of his youngest brother from the far side of the fireplace began to sing the air of Oft in the Stilly Night. One by one, the others took up the air until the full choir of voices was singing. They would sing so for hours, melody after melody, glee after glee, till the last pale light died down on the horizon, till the first dark night clouds came forth and night fell. He waited for some moments, listening, before he too took up the air with them. He was listening with pain of spirit to the overtone of weariness behind their frail, fresh, innocent voices. Even before they set out on life's journey, they seemed weary already of the way. He heard the choir of voices in the kitchen echoed and multiplied through an endless reverberation of choirs of endless generations of children, and heard in all the echoes an echo also of the recurring note of weariness and pain. All seemed weary of life even before entering upon it, and he remembered that Newman had heard this note also in the broken lines of Virgil, giving utterance, like the voice of nature herself, to that pain and weariness, yet hope of better things, which has been the experience of her children in every time. Next, please.
He could wait no longer. From the door of Byron's public house to the gate of Clontarf Chapel, from the gate of Clontarf Chapel to the door of Byron's house, and then back again to the chapel, and then back again to the public house. He had paced slowly at first, planting his steps scrupulously in the spaces of the patchwork of the footpath, then timing their fall to the fall of verses. A full hour had passed since his father had gone in with Dan Crosby, the tutor, to find out for him something about the university. For a full hour he had paced up and down, waiting, but he could wait no longer. He set off abruptly for the bowl, walking rapidly lest his father's shrill whistle might call him back. And in a few moments he had rounded the curve at the police barrack and was safe. Yes, his mother was hostile to the idea, and as he had read from her listless silence, yet her mistrust pricked him more keenly than his father's pride, and he thought coldly how he had watched the faith which was fading down in his soul, aging and strengthening in her eyes. A dim antagonism gathered force within him and darkened his mind as a cloud against her disloyalty, and when it passed, cloud-like, leaving his mind serene and dutiful towards her again, he was made aware dimly and without regret of a first noiseless sundering of their lives. The university. So he had passed beyond the challenge of the centuries who had stood as guardians of his boyhood and had sought to keep him among them, that he might be subject to them and serve their ends. Pride after satisfaction uplifted him like long, slow waves. The end he had been born to serve, yet did he see, had led him to escape by an unseen path, and now would beckon to him once more, and a new adventure was about to be opened to him. It seemed to him that he heard notes of fitful music leaping upwards a tone and downwards a diminishing fourth, upwards a tone and downwards a major third, like triple branching flames leaping fitfully, flame after flame, out of a midnight wood. It was an elfin prelude, endless and formless, and it grew wilder and faster, the flames leaping out of time. He seemed to hear from under the boughs and grasses wild creatures racing, their feet pattering like rain upon the leaves. Their feet passed in pattering tumult over his mind, the feet of hares and rabbits, the feet of harts and hinds and antelopes, until he heard them no more and remembered only a proud cadence from Newman, whose feet are as the feet of harts, and underneath the everlasting arms. The pride of that dim image brought back to his mind the dignity of the office he had refused. All through his boyhood, he had mused upon that which he had so often thought to be his destiny. And when the moment had come for him to obey the call, he had turned aside, obeying a wayward instinct. Now time lay between. The oils of ordination would never anoint his body. He had refused. Why? Next.
He turned seaward from the road at Dollymount, and as he passed on to the thin wooden bridge, he felt the planks shaking with the tramp of heavily shod feet. A squad of Christian Brothers was on its way back from the bowl, and had begun to pass two by two across the bridge. Soon The whole bridge was trembling and resounding. The uncouth faces passed him two by two, strained yellow or red or livid by the sea. And as he strove to look at them with ease and indifference, a faint stain of personal shame and commiseration rose to his own face. Angry with himself, he tried to hide his face from their eyes by gazing sideways into the shallow, swirling water under the bridge. But he still saw a reflection therein of their top-heavy silk hats and humble tape-like collars and loosely hanging clerical clothes. Brother Hickey, Brother Quaid, Brother McArdle, Brother Keogh. Their piety would be like their names, like their faces, like their clothes. And it was idle for him to tell himself that their humble and contrite hearts, it might be, paid a far richer tribute of devotion than his had ever been, a gift tenfold more acceptable than his elaborate adoration. It was idle for him to move himself to be generous towards them, to tell himself that if he ever came to their gate, stripped of his pride, beaten in beggars' weeds, that they would be generous towards him, loving him as themselves. Idle and embittered, finally to argue against his own dispassionate certitude that the commandment of love bade us not to love our neighbors as ourselves with the same amount of intensity of love, but to love him as ourselves with the same kind of love. Next, please.
He drew forth a phrase from his treasure and spoke it softly to himself. A day of dappled sea-born clouds. The phrase and the day and the scene harmonized in accord. Words. Was it their colors? He allowed them to glow and fade, hue after hue, sunrise gold, the russet, the green of apple orchards, the azure of waves, the green fringed fleece, the gray fringed fleece of clouds. No, it was not their colors. It was the poise and balance of the period itself. Did he then love the rhythmic rise and fall of words better than their associations of legend and color? Or was it that, being as weak of sight as he was shy of mind, he drew less pleasure from the reflection of the glowing, sensible world through the prism of a language many-colored and richly storied than from the contemplation of an inner world of individual emotions mirrored perfectly in a lucid, supple, periodic prose? He passed from the trembling bridge onto firm land again. At that instant, it seemed to him the air was chilled, and looking askance towards the water, he saw a flying squall darkening and crisping suddenly the tide. A faint click at his heart, a faint throb in his throat, told him once more of how his flesh dreaded the cold, infrahuman odor of the sea. Yet he did not strike across the downs on his left, but held straight on along the spine of rocks that pointed against the river's mouth. A veiled sunlight lit up faintly the grey sheet of water where the river was embayed. In the distance, along the course of the slow-flowing Liffey, slender masts flecked the sky, and, more distant still, the dim fabric of the city lay prone in haze. Like a scene on some vague arras, old as man's weariness, the image of the seventh city of Christendom was visible to him across the timeless air, nor older, nor more weary, nor less patient of subjection than in the days of the Thingmont. Disheartened, he raised his eyes towards the slow drifting clouds, dappled and sea-born. They were voyaging across the deserts of the sky, a host of nomads on the march, voyaging high over Ireland, westward bound. The Europe they had come from lay out there beyond the Irish Sea, Europe of strange tongues, and valleyed and wood-begirt and citadelled and of entrenched and marshalled races. He heard a confused music within him, as of memories and names, which he was almost conscious of, but could not capture even for an instant. Then the music seemed to recede, to recede, to recede. And from each receding trail of nebulous music, there fell always one long-drawn calling note, piercing like a star the dusk of silence. Again, again, again. A voice from beyond the world was calling, and
Hello, Stephanus. Here comes the Daedalus. Give it over, Dwyer, I'm telling you, or I'll give you a stuff in the kisser for yourself. Good man, Towser, duck him. Come along, Daedalus. Boyos Stefan Monmios. Boyos Stefan for us. Duck him, Guzzle. Him now, Towser. Hell, hell. He recognized their speech collectively before he distinguished their faces. The mere sight of that medley of wet nakedness chilled him to the bone. Their bodies corpse white or suffused with a pallid golden light, or rawly tanned by the sun, gleamed with the wet of the sea. Their diving stone, poised on its rude supports and rocking under their plunges, and the rough-hewn stones of the sloping breakwater over which they scrambled in their horseplay gleamed with cold, wet lustre. The towels with which they smacked their bodies were heavy with cold seawater, and drenched with cold brine was their matted hair. He stood still in deference to their calls, and parried their banter with easy words. How characterless they looked, Shule without his deep unbuttoned collar, Ennis without his scarlet belt with a snaky clasp, and Connolly without his Norfolk coat with the flapless side pockets. It was a pain to see them, and a sword-like pain to see the signs of adolescence that made repellent their pitiless nakedness. Perhaps they had taken refuge in number and noise from the secret dread in their souls. But he, apart from them and in silence, remembered in what dread he stood of the mystery of his own body. Stephanus Daedalus, Boyos Stefan Numerus, Boyos Stefan Foros. Their banter was not new to him, and now it flattered his mild, proud sovereignty. Now, as never before, his strange name seemed to him a prophecy. So timeless seemed the grey, warm air, so fluid and impersonal of his own mood, that all ages were as one to him. A moment before, the ghost of the ancient kingdom of the Danes had looked forth through the vesture of the haze-wrapped city. Now, at the name of the fabulous artificer, he seemed to hear the noise of dim waves, and to see a winged form flying above the waves and slowly climbing the air. What did it mean? Was it a quaint device opening a page of some medieval book of prophecies and symbols? A hawk-like man flying sunward above the sea, a prophecy of the end he had been born to serve, and had been following through the mist of childhood and boyhood. A symbol of the artist forging anew in his workshop, out of the sluggish matter of the earth, a new soaring, impalpable, impersonable being. Next, please.
His heart trembled. His breath came faster, and a wild spirit passed over his limbs as though he were soaring sunward. His heart trembled in an ecstasy of fear, and his soul was in flight. His soul was soaring in an air beyond the world and the body he knew was purified in a breath and delivered of incertitude and made radiant and commingled with the element of the spirit. An ecstasy of flight made radiant his eyes, and wild his breath, and tremulous, and wild and radiant his windswept limbs. 1, 2, look out! Oh, cripes, I'm drowned. 1, 2, 3, and away! Me next, me next! One, ugh, Stephanophoros. His throat ached with a desire to cry aloud, the cry of a hawk or eagle on high, to cry piercingly of his deliverance to the winds. This was the call of life to his soul, not the dull, gross voice of the world of duties and despair, not the inhuman voice that had called him to the pale service of the altar. An instant of wild flight had delivered him, and the cry of triumph which his lips withheld cleft his brain. Stephanophoros. What were they now but cerements shaken from the body of death? The fear he had walked in night and day, the incertitude that had ringed him round, the shame that had abased him within and without. Cerements, the linens of the grave. His soul had arisen from the grave of boyhood, spurning her grave clothes. Yes, yes, yes. He would create proudly out of the freedom and power of his soul as the great artificer whose name he bore, a living thing, new and soaring and beautiful, impalpable, imperishable. He started up nervously from the stone block, for he could no longer quench the flame in his blood. He felt his cheeks aflame and his throat throbbing with song. There was a lust of wandering in his feet that burned to set out for the ends of the earth. On, his heart seemed to cry. Evening would deepen above the sea, night fall upon the plains, dawn glimmer before the wanderer, and show him strange fields and hills and faces. Where? Next, please.
He looked northward toward Howth. The sea had fallen below the line of sea wrack on the shallow side of the breakwater, and already the tide was running out fast along the foreshore. Already one long oval bank of sand lay warm and dry amid the wavelets. Here and there warm isles of sand gleamed above the shallow tide, and about the isles and along the long bank and amid the shallow currents of the beach were light-clad, gay-clad figures wading and delving. In a few moments he was barefoot, his stockings folded in his pockets and his canvas shoes dangling by their knotted laces over his shoulders, and picking a pointed, salt-eaten stick out of the jetsam among the rocks, he clambered down the slope of the breakwater. There was a long rivulet in the strand, and as he waded slowly up its course, he wondered at the endless drift of seaweed, emerald and black and russet and olive. It moved beneath the current, swaying and turning. The water of the rivulet was dark with endless drift and mirrored the high drifting clouds. The clouds were drifting above him silently, and silently the sea tangle was drifting below him, and the gray warm air was still, and a new wild life was singing in his veins. Where was his boyhood now? Where was the soul that had hung back from her destiny to brood alone upon the shame of her wounds, and in her house of squalor and subterfuge, to queen it in favorite cerements and in wreaths that withered at the touch? Oh, where was he? Next, please.
He was alone. He was unheeded, happy and near to the wild heart of life. He was alone and young and willful and wild-hearted, alone amid a waste of wild air and brackish waters, and the sea harvest of shells and tangle and veiled gray sunlight, and gay-clad, light-clad figures of children and girls, and voices childish and girlish in the air. A girl stood before him in midstream, alone and still, gazing out to sea. She seemed like one whom magic had changed into the likeness of a strange and beautiful seabird. Her long, slender, bare legs were delicate as a crane's, and pure save where an emerald trail of seaweed had fashioned itself as a sign upon the flesh. Her thighs, fuller and soft-hued as ivory, were bared almost to the hips, where the white fringes of her drawers were like featherings of soft white down. Her slate blue skirts were kilted boldly about her waist and dovetailed behind her. Her bosom was as a bird's soft and slight, slight and soft as the breast of some dark plumaged dove. But her long fair hair was girlish and touched with the wonder of mortal beauty, her face. She was alone and still gazing out to sea, and when she felt his presence and the worship of his eyes, her eyes turned to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze, without shame or wantonness. Long, long she suffered his gaze, and then quietly withdrew her eyes from his and bent them towards the stream, gently stirring the water with her foot, hither and thither. The first faint noise of gently moving water broke the silence, low and faint and whispering, faint as the bells of sleep, hither and thither, and a faint flame trembled on her cheek. Heavenly God, cried Stephen's soul in an outburst of profane joy. Next, please.
He turned away from her subtly and set off across the strand. His cheeks were aflame, his body was aglow, his limbs were trembling. On and on and on and on he strode, far out over the sands, singing wildly to the sea, crying to greet the advent of the life that had cried to him. Her image had passed into his soul forever, and no word had broken the holy silence of his ecstasy. His eyes had called him, and his soul had leaped to the call, to live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. A wild angel had appeared to him, the angel of mortal youth and beauty, an envoy from the fair courts of life, to throw open before him an instant of ecstasy, the gates of all the ways of error and glory. On and on and on. He halted suddenly and heard his heart in the silence. How far had he walked? What hour was it? There was no human figure near him, nor any sound borne to him over the air. But the tide was near the turn, and already the day was on the wane. He turned landward and ran towards the shore, and running up the sloping beach, reckless of the sharp shingle, found a sandy nook amid a ring of tufted sand knolls, and lay down there, that the peace and the silence of the evening might still the riot of his blood. He felt above him the vast, indifferent dome and the calm processes of heavenly bodies, and the earth beneath him, the earth that had borne him, had taken him to her breast. He closed his eyes in the languor of sleep. His eyelids trembled as if they felt the vast cyclic movement of the earth and her watches, trembled as if they felt the strange light of some new world. His soul was swooning to some new world, fantastic, dim, uncertain as undersea, traversed by cloudy shapes of beings. A world, a glimmer, or a flower? Glimmering and trembling and unfolding, a breaking light, an opening flower. It spread in endless succession to itself, breaking in full crimson and unfolding and fading to palest rose, leaf by leaf, wave of light by wave of light, flooding all the heavens with its soft flushes, every flush deeper than other. Evening had fallen when he woke, and the sand and arid grasses of his bed glowed no longer. He rose so slowly, and recalling the rapture of his sleep, sighed at its joy. He climbed to the crest of the sandhill and gazed about him. Evening had fallen. A rim of the young moon cleft the pale waste of skyline, the rim of a silver hoop embedded in gray sand, and the tide was flowing in fast to the land with a low whisper of her waves, islanding a few last figures in distant pools.
Bravo.
Yes.
Wow. Thank you, friends.
Wow.
Yeah. All right.
I don't remember reading that Joyce had actually gone through such a crisis that he had contemplated joining the priesthood. Is that something that he just wrote for the book, or did that actually happen to him? Nobody knows?
The idea that that did not happen is beyond contemplation for
Yeah.
anyone who is brought up in that sort of an environment.
Yeah.
Mm,
You would be singled out for a vocation. It was the biggest subject in my final year of conversation among boys, and this was 1965. So Joyce was targeted, you can be sure.
Yeah,
And he was secretary of the Sodality of the Blessed Virgin in Clongowes. I'm sure if I pick up Ellman, I'd find references to it there. You know, I mean, that made my spine shiver reading that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So true,
Yeah.
every part of it.
Yeah.
I give a look at Ellman and see what he says. Talk among yourselves.
Okay.
I was struck many times by how much of his later writings is right here in what we read today. How much of Ulysses, how much of Finnegan's Wake was right in these pages. I mean, that his musings about all of the people who had been in Dublin before him and all of, you know, that's like right out of that section of the Wake where he's talking about the whales and the beaching of the whale and going back in time. It's all right here. And then there's so much about the first 3 episodes of Ulysses, so much of that episode, that his thinking about his mother, and then what we see in Ulysses when his mother has died and he's refused to kneel, and it's all this, the embers of it are right here, and he really does nurture them and make them glow later in his other writings. But you can see where his mind was taken. You can see where his heart and his soul was taken as a young man. It's remarkably beautifully written.
Oh my, that's
Yes.
for sure. That for sure.
I haven't read this in over 50 years.
Mhm.
And that last scene, I still remember.
Mm.
I remember reading it as a 20-year-old. And it stayed with me then, and it stays with me now.
Yeah. You beat me. I read it 30 years ago.
Let's see now. I read it
Probably last week.
well, yeah, no, but I read it 60 years ago first in high school. And then go ahead.
Speaking of reading this, and this may be too early to bring this up, and I'm sorry if this is a downer, but when this was published, who read it? Who reviewed it? Who gave any thought about it? And I think what I'm saying is, did devout Catholics read it? Did people who had nothing to do with Catholicism read it and review it and have a sense? I mean, this is so incredibly tied to Catholic dogma and Catholic adolescent upbringing that, you know, would a guy in Bhutan have any idea what this was about? So when it was published, because I don't know this, when this was published so many years ago and it was reviewed, did people say, well, yes, this is a fabulous book that deals with these very interesting issues, and let's discuss the Catholic background to this? Did Catholics read it? Did Catholics ignore it?
It got lost in the First World War.
Yeah, it was published
It wasn't
1916.
read. It wasn't read at all. It was hardly reviewed. I mean, he had such a hard time getting it even published. But then when he did, it was, the war.
Yeah,
It was also 1916, wasn't it?
1916.
So-
yeah.
Yeah, so
Preoccupied him. It had a very small readership, but
Mhm.
kind of key people in literature were reading it, but not people in the back of the Royal Cathedral in Dublin.
Mm. Well,
Because so much of it is Catholic oriented that I
oh
wonder,
yeah, yeah.
if a non-Catholic read it, did they get it? Are these
Yeah.
really universals?
No.
Are these universal concepts? I don't think so.
I do think so. In fact, I will give myself as an example because I'm not Catholic. I went with a friend one time to a catechism class. I think I was like in the 5th grade, and I found it curious and weird. But I went on to have my own religious experiences.
Mm.
And although my experiences were not Catholic at all, the overall thrust, the overall pattern of this fits extremely well.
Yeah.
And I think whether you're Protestant or Buddhist or Hindu or even Islamic, a moderately sensitive reading of this would come through pretty clearly.
I agree with you, but there is something that has been lost to modern readers. Modern Catholics
Mm.
did not have this experience. Some of us older fellows who who were around in the 50s and 60s certainly did, but not after Vatican II. And so much has changed in the Catholic Church that that's an experience they wouldn't have had. But it's not to say, as you said, Duncan, that a sensitive reader could not understand it and could not feel it. That is certainly true.
Yeah, it's
But the subtleties of that experience, I think, are lost to younger people.
Mhm.
absolutely so. I meet the present generation of boys in my school, and they have no concept. We would have had about 3 dozen priests teaching us.
Right.
And in that college now there's one priest, and most of the boys have never met him.
Yeah.
Mm.
And they're all talking about their identity and their gender fluidity and all sorts of stuff.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, lay teachers were a rarity when I was young, but now you can go to the Jesuit high school and never have a Jesuit for a teacher.
Yeah.
That experience of seeing a flock of Jesuits in their soutanes sweeping down the hall, striding down the hall, that's unforgettable.
The swish of the soutane.
Swish.
You read.
Mhm, yeah.
I can hear that on the stairs. You hear one coming.
Yeah.
The swish coming up the stairs, and you behave yourself. And the other strange thing that we never encountered, we never had a female teacher.
Yep.
It's all male.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I can't find any reference in Elman to a vocation. So that kind of, but the V word, he heard that. No doubt that he heard the V word. I love his description of the bridge out on the Bull Wall. Does anyone? I haven't been there for years, but the trembling bridge. Does anyone remember the bridge out to the Bull Wall? It's just that one word, trembling, says it. It was timber, and it trembled as you walked on it.
Mhm.
It's beautiful.
Jerry, you got something you wanna say or add or?
Yeah, I really appreciate this reading. And I'm 70 years old and I was raised Roman Catholic. And I indeed was raised and taught by women. They're called nuns. And I fell in love with my nuns. They were beautiful women and they taught me about guardian angels.
Yes.
But I'm a fluke of my generation because most Roman Catholics checked out, according to me, interviewing hundreds of people over 40 years. Between 13 and 18, most people check out of all the religions they were raised.
Yeah.
I personally feel that I'm a fluke because I never said, oh, I'm checking out of the Roman Catholic Church. I don't go to church, but I do pray. And a woman I interviewed the other day, an artist, one of my questions is, do you pray? And she said, yeah, for parking spaces. But
Yes.
he was basically saying, I don't pray, and I don't believe that, but I pray in another way. You know, I pray to this energy or this, you know, the same mumbo jumbo we believe in for Roman Catholics, whether it's the guy with the beard, you know, or some force. But I'm curious because the word fasting came up in this text today. And I'm perplexed by that word because I looked it up on Wikipedia and it called it a pseudoscience. So if you have an operation and your doctor says, don't eat for a day, they're saying, well, that's a pseudoscience. No, they're saying that's part of science.
Yeah.
Does Joyce, now I somehow brainwashed myself along with my upbringing to believe that prayer works. Did Joyce abandon prayer eventually and abandon the idea of sinning? I don't believe we're born with sin. When you're a kid, that's when you're less likely to have sin. But I don't believe really in sinning. I think people fail, but it seems as though sinning is a pseudoscience. The idea of sinning, that it's humans failing or having strengths or their weaknesses. So sorry to ramble on and on. Basic question is did Joyce believe in prayer and sin, or did he abandon those ideas?
You'd have to interview him, Jerry, but I would think yes, he had abandoned prayer and sin, but I can't say that with any authority at all. That's just my impression based on everything I know about him and everything I've read by him.
Yeah, it's also that great.
Because that's one of the things between the ages of 13 and 18, when you do abandon whatever faith you'd been raised in, that would be part and parcel of it. Petition the Lord with prayer.
Yeah.
You can't petition the Lord with prayer. You know?
But it also reminds me of a line that I ask is, you create what you resist, or the comedian Bob Goldthwait morphed it into, you are what you hate. And Joyce said, it's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve. Yeah. So it's like Louis Buñuel, Frank Zappa, and James Joyce all they need their Catholicism for, to deal with what they're dealing with, to make their art. And Louis Buñuel nailed it. He said, thank God I'm an atheist.
I would say that Joyce transmuted. Joyce did pray, only his form of praying was writing.
Yeah.
And that's for him to do the type of writing he did without much recognition for so many years.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Is to me a sign that was his form of praying. And did he believe in sin? I believe that Joyce, through most of his life, looked for dark shadows flying overhead that might attack him for some of the blaspheming he did. I don't think he ever gave up on the idea of total his son. He like he did with so many things, he transmuted it
That's
and
me.
gave it a different interpretation.
I love that quote from, sorry, beg your pardon, I'm going to cut across you.
No, go right ahead.
And I love that quote of Joyce. He said he was not a Catholic, he was a Jesuit. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I met, I ran into a fellow at one of the Irish clubs here in Cleveland, and
Yeah.
and he said, so what high school did you go to? And I said, I went to St. Ignatius, the Jesuit school. He says, that's not a Catholic school.
Yeah.
The totally religion. Well, when I was in Boston for a short time, I had a girlfriend who was a designated sacrifice in her family. And she had gone into a nunnery at the age of 16. And she came out of the nunnery at the age of, I believe she was 24.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
I had met her a year or two after she had just said, that's it, I'm done. And
Yeah.
left and immigrated to America.
Yeah. And our next door neighbor that I grew, the street I grew up on, next door neighbor had 3 girls. They all went in to be nuns, and they all left.
And they all left the nunnery later.
They all left at different stages. Eventually, they were all out of it. So by the 1980s, I'd meet them in the supermarket.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
It was just that
that was, that was their parents, driving.
Yeah, the families loved having a nun.
Oh, it's a
and
nice
priest in the
very
family.
good thing to have a priest in the family, Anne, wasn't it? Just
Right.
A few weeks ago, I was at my cousin's 65th Jubilee or 65th year as a nun. And I know I went to grade school with 3 girls, sisters, who all became nuns, and they're still nuns to this day. So it's not. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to ask, is that a desirable thing in a family with 3 girls? Would they want all 3? I mean, it seems to me they would go, wait, 1 or 2 is enough. All 3 of you?
But wait a minute. It's not the families, it's the girls. So if the girls choose this,
In this case,
yes, if the girls choose this, who are we to say anything further? It's a fulfillment for them. It does what it needs to do for them. So let's stop saying that they're pushed into this.
well, there's the reason you say they are. I wouldn't say push, but they are guided towards
encouraged.
particular choices. And let's say they may not have had the full range of possibilities presented.
Yes.
That's sort of an environment.
There's a downward spiral. I mean, with fewer and fewer people going into vocation, there are fewer and fewer opportunities for someone to mentor or to seduce someone into the vocation, the way this priest was seducing Stephen, the way the nuns seduced my sister into the convent, the way some of my friends in high school. I have a very good friend who left high school at the age of 16 to join the Cistercian order, and saw him years later after he had left the order, but and we're still in touch and very good friends. But it was a very seductive thing, and there's also that kind of adolescent pride that takes over, where I could be the greatest martyr that ever lived. I could fast for hours. I could subject, like as Joyce was doing himself.
Yeah.
Describes it.
Yeah, because Joyce was visualizing how he would look as a priest.
Yes.
How he'd walk up the steps and how he'd go into the confessional.
Right.
And it appeals to idealism as well. And young people are very idealistic and they just go for it. I had the advantage of some of my teachers who were priests left the orders and married. Some of them had to go to the United States, even though they couldn't be around Ireland. And they've only recently passed away. And it's amazing to know them, and also to know men who are now old men who were student priests that have gone the distance. So you sort of see both sides of it. It was sort of a strange time.
And there is such a thing as a vocation.
There is such a thing as a vocation. I do not deny it at all, but I would say that in a society, whether it's Southern Baptist or Roman Catholic, I will continue to use the word some people are pushed into it.
Yes. Oh, I'm sure.
Into it. And my question really had to do with, I studied sociology. And the study of sociology is, in one sense, the study of how, the structure of community channels people into certain directions. And also, I certainly, with nowhere near the good results of James Joyce, I've gone through this basic pattern. I've gone to the point to where when I was away from home, traveling with my father in Guatemala, and it was Sunday, and I had no way to take communion, I went down to the bar in the hotel and got, some wine and some saltine crackers and went into a bathroom stall and gave myself communion. Okay. And I went, and so I went into that part of it. And then I came to the part where I realized a year or two later that, hey, I'm going out and carousing on Saturday night, and then I'm sitting in the pew kind of nodding. I got to make a choice here. What am I going to do? My choice was Saturday night.
Duncan, we use
in grade school, one of the outfits that my mother got me was a Monsignor. I was a Monsignor for Halloween with a Monsignor hat, which is different. But I was nothing because there was a boy in my school whose mother hand-sewn bishop's vest. He was a bishop. Still satin. It was unbelievable. He was so beautiful. And my sister had a nun's outfit for Halloween. So we used to play mass at home. We'd get Necco wafers or something and do the whole thing. But your idea of community, Duncan, is it. If you're in that, it's not a question of being pushed, but the whole community is directing you. And if you sense that as a child, that everyone would love if I was a priest or a nun. It seemed like every family had to have at least one person in the order to have any kind of standing. But there's no difference. The other thing that struck me when you were talking is that the village shaman would notice the young boy who had certain sensitivities and would start nurturing him, or the village woman midwife, or whatever, healer. Same thing. You would, a community will try to extend itself into the future by picking out certain people, and there's no difference between that and what was happening to Stephen. The priest recognized something in him that he thought might be. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, you can see that in the talk where Stephen is projecting his image of himself as a priest and how he would be at confession and how he would look, in his clothes and all that. And this is a very human thing. This is what humans do. When we're deciding what to do in the future, we project images of what it would look like and how people would respond to us and how we could be of service or whatever. So
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
does so beautifully. I mean, it's of course, as we go into Ulysses and we go into Finnegan's Wake, we see more mature versions of some of this book. But the level of which he wrote this book is
Hmm.
astounding.
Will
It's not-
people understand this book in 200 years' time? You know,
I think so.
okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
and to be in those terms that you're describing.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. I think so. I think that this is a human pattern. But like even with what we read today, I will tell you honestly that I really like the earlier part of today where he's talking with the head guy and then he's thinking about the priest thing. I love the part with the family where he's imagined the family and then he has all of his brothers and sisters coming together to sing and all of this. I love the image of the young girl at the seashore.
Bird
But
girl.
to me, the last, with the exception of the girl at the seashore, which I thought was perfect, some of that was a little, oh God, here I'm going to put my foot in, a little immature and grandiose compared to the earlier sections.
Right.
I don't know why, and I'll probably be proven horribly wrong sometime in the future, but for today, that was my reaction. The first-
Joyce,
But Joyce is writing from the point of view of a young and immature
Yeah.
person who would have grandiose ideas. So he's
Yeah.
very, very romantic.
Joyce mentioned the idea of security as being a motivating factor.
Yeah.
Do you find that is a large factor?
Huge
Uh,
factor. It was a
A
huge factor. Huge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure it is.
I think there are women
Hmm.
that join, become nuns often
yeah.
for that reason. Yeah.
And very attractive for, say, someone like Stephen, they're drinking out of jam jars at home.
Yeah, that I was thinking of that.
You
The
could,
homes,
you'll always have a roof over your head and 3 square meals. But when Joyce met Martha Fleischmann, my memory serves me, he asked her, he told her about the Seabird girl. Was she ever in Dublin?
Hmm.
He thought that this was the Seabird girl again, Martha Fleischmann in Zurich.
In Zurich, yeah.
So like that's he's a mature man by then. He's a married man by then. By the time he's sort of.
But all of us have an image in our minds of a girl when we were 12 or 13 who made that same impression on us.
Absolutely.
And maybe that's the person we look for the rest of our lives. And some of us are lucky enough to find them. Some,
Yeah, Bill, I
They're
think
still looking.
Bill, you aspired to be a priest when you were young. Is that correct? Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
and same with me. And it's interesting because Duncan's line that writing became a form of prayer for Joyce.
Yeah.
I think Zoom conversations about Joyce have become Bill and I's form of prayer. It's like how we unite people in like a chorus or a choir.
Yes.
My great regret, I had one nun when I was studying to be an altar boy. And I had auditioned to be in the boys' choir, and I had perfect pitch, and the choir master was thrilled, and I loved singing. It was probably the loudest singer in the church, no matter what service was going on. But the nun told me I had to choose. Couldn't do both. I don't know why, because there were other people who I grew up with who I knew were both altar boys and in the choir, but for some reason I had to choose. So of course I gave up the choir and became an altar boy because that idealism of, well, if you believe in this, why would want to be an altar boy.
Yeah. Well, in my case, the altar boys, we wore red and white. And this
So
was a
hold on.
stunning outfit.
We have three
Compared to
altar
black.
boys. We have three altar boys here today.
Yeah.
Jerry,
I-
Jerry, Bill, and Joe, right?
Yeah, and to celebrate that, Duncan, sorry to
we could say
be
mass for you guys.
sorry to be irreverent in a Joycean satirical way. How do you get a nun pregnant? Dress her up like an altar boy.
There you go.
Oh,
Sorry.
Too soon, Jerry, too soon.
yeah.
But going Bill on the question of music, the thing I loved about being an altar boy was because like we had a huge community to serve. And the choir was the priests themselves. The singing was fantastic at 6:30 in the morning in a dark winter morning with candlelight. I can still hear the Te Deum and the Credo, and yeah, it was fantastic. It was like it was a very nice life to get into.
Tantum ergo sacramentum veneremur antiquum documentum
No voce dat ritui restet fide supplementum sensum defectui. And then the chorus comes in, you know.
Wow.
So bless you all,
Yeah.
my brethren.
Yeah, that's
I think on that note, a couple of last comments and then we'll wrap it up for today. But
I'm just glad that Joyce saw the light.
Isa est.
Eh.
Ecum Spiri 220.
May God have mercy on all your souls.
there we go.
And also with
Reading this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's why I love Frank Zappa. In the middle of one of his songs, he sings Ecum Spiri 220. You can eat my sleazy pancakes just for saintly Alfonso. He throws in an altar boy line in the middle of one of his songs. It's like, what?
Yeah. That's good.
Well,
I promise never to sing again.
Oh,
No,
no.
it was great. Joe.
oh, you need to sing whenever the urge arises. Please sing and share with us. But I want to tell you, this is my church. These
Thank you.
readings between this and the Ulysses reading and the Dante reading. I mean, I'm slowly going back into religion in a new way.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be the road.
So
Thank you.
Okay.
very, very
Thanks,
much.
everybody. Thanks, Duncan.
Good
See
night,
you next
everyone,
week.
and thank you very much.
Here we go.